Thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence. And the first thing I'd like to do is to pay tribute to Dr. Lawrence, who apparently was the individual who really had the idea for this lecture series. You know, when you have a chance to get together with somebody beforehand, talk with them a little bit, and I think we all owe a great round of applause to Bob Lawrence, because without his initiative, this lecture series that so many of you have been experiencing would really not have occurred. I've reached the stage in my life where I can practically say anything I want about Battleship Cove, and the reason for that is so many of the people, this is an unfortunate issue, but so many of the people who I've been intimately involved with back in the early years, 64 through particularly 75, are no longer here. So I'm sure if I get really out of line, they'll haunt me from above. One of the things I've always found rather symbolic about Battleship Cove is the fact that it lies really at the mouth of the Quequechan River. And of course, when we look at the history of the community of Fall River and look at the development of the mills and everything that made Fall River, provided the genesis of Fall River's basic infrastructure, it was really created by the Quequechan River. So the fact that Battleship Cove is at the mouth of the Quequechan River and has brought kind of a new way of life to an area that was really at best extremely downtrodden back there in the late 50s and early 60s, I have always found to be particularly refreshing. I do want to make it very clear to everybody, and I think it goes without saying, that Battleship Cove is an educational nonprofit corporation, and the emphasis really is in the nonprofit area. I'll be happy to talk about what I know, and I've been a little bit away from it on some of the day-to-day operations for a number of years, but I've got kind of a perspective on it, and I know it's still very much strictly nonprofit. One of the things that has been a major part of my life, is the people who actually were involved in the creation of Battleship Cove really were a group of probably somewhere around 12 to 15 individuals. Several of them knew each other, but literally nobody had ever worked with each other. And I always found that to be rather remarkable. There were people who were from Fall River, there were people who were from the greater Boston area, but they had all kind of come together in this cause from various independent ways of life. I got scooped into this in 1964 when I had been made the commanding officer of the Reserve Surface Division here in Fall River. I never should have had the job because it was a commander's billet, and at the time I was a lieutenant. How it ever happened, who knows? But the point is, several of those individuals, when Fall River had an opportunity as far as Battleship Cove went, particularly the battleship, I should say, because that's how it all got started. They said, why don't we go ahead and get this guy on board? And I think it was Jack Brayton, who a number of you know, who wound up being my successor and also the treasurer for the 10 years that I was the president of the corporation. I think it was Jack who said, find a front man and I'll back him up. Well, I didn't know Jack Brayton at all, but I guess I became his front man is really what happened. And it was a wonderful experience. The association that I had with Jack, I didn't know anything about cash flow or all sorts of other things business-wise at the time, but Jack was very kind to me, very supportive, and he was an individual who was really very much ahead of his time. So, how it all happened, and I guess the message in this is you don't need a club. You don't need a lot of people to do anything of real substance that requires, you know, all of this camaraderie and relationship. If the cause is right and the capacity is there to pull it off, people kind of come together and just get it done. Flat organizations, no titles to speak of, but, you know, bottom line, just make it happen. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a couple of people who really made created Fall River's opportunity, because it wasn't anybody here in Fall River who really did. There were two critical people in this whole process, actually probably two or three. One of those individuals was a fellow by the name of Ed Palmer, who was a yeoman on the ship during World War II, and he held the USS Massachusetts Associates Crew Members Association together for a period of from 1945 when the war ended, and 1947 when the ship was decommissioned. He held the crew members together for a period of from 1947 through almost 20 years. It was 18 years, actually 17 years until 1964. And he was the bond, and without his unfailing commitment to make things happen and holding those people together, the opportunity for Fall River never would have happened. One of the members of this church, who unfortunately passed away this year, another individual I had awesome respect for, Paul Weitze, served as the chairman of the board of the Battleship for a number of years, and then subsequently became the executive director, relocated down here with Maxine, raised their family here, and have become critical components of this community. The other individual who was absolutely a critical personality in it was somebody who was born in Coney Island. Okay, he was from Coney Island. We have a number of distinguished, capable ex-New Yorkers who have really made great contributions to our community. I see Myron Wilner sitting here, and I know he and his wife have relocated here, but this fellow, Marty Adler, I have to mention another New Yorker who's relocated here, my wife, Sheila. But Marty Adler was the individual who worked for the Boston Redevelopment Authority, and when the ship was available, which was now like 1964, probably late 63, early 64, the Boston Redevelopment Authority thought that bringing the battleship to Boston and putting it Pier 2, where the federal courthouse is right now, would be a good idea. The Port Authority wouldn't buy that, but Adler called. The critical thing Adler did a lot of critical things, but the first thing he did was he called the people who he used to work for in Providence at the Providence Development Authority and said, could we take the Battleship Massachusetts into Providence for a period of about 6 months until we can work things out with the Mass Port Authority in Boston? And the answer was no, because the only pier we have is a fully active pier to be able to accommodate a ship of that size and scale. And somebody who's never been identified said, why don't you try the state pier in Fall River? So the linkage between the crew members organization and between what actually happened here in Fall River was generated by an Army private from Coney Island. And Marty was an exceptional individual. I'll talk a little bit about some of the other things he did, because physically what you see down there today is really all Martin Adler. And he never really, in all of those years, he worked for the ship probably, I'm willing to bet in various projects that Marty was involved with, I'll bet Marty didn't get probably more than $25,000 or $30,000 over a period of 35 years. He got less than $1,000 a year for whatever it was that he was doing, because he also was working for, he had another job full-time, and he used to try and fit these things in along the way. But he was a very creative individual. Let's see. I got to mention a lawyer for this operation. When we first came into this opportunity, and we went down to get the ship in Washington, I said to Jack Brayton, I said, Jack, we're sitting in his office one afternoon, right after we got elected. We got elected on a Saturday. Monday afternoon, I'm in Brayton's office, and I say to him, I don't know about you, but I'm not going any further without a good lawyer. He gets the yellow pages of the phone book out, and he starts marking off. To people who know Jack, you can relate to this. He starts marking off people who he thinks will be candidates for the job. And then he goes, and he left, and he went to talk to Alan Thompson, who was the trust officer for the BMC Durfee Trust Company at that point. He comes back and he says, I think the guy we should get is Pat Harrington. Well, we look across the street, because Brayton was on the second floor, we look across the street into the Bennett building, and there's Harrington sitting at his desk. So we go over there to see Harrington, and Harrington says to us, if you two guys had ever come to talk to me before you took this job, the respective jobs that you took on Saturday morning, my advice would be, don't do it. But he said, if people, I wouldn't have any clients if that ever happened. So lo and behold, we go to White. Pat was the perfect guy for this job. The reason was he was a Naval Reserve captain. He also was a very capable attorney. He was a negotiator. He was the counsel for the New Bedford, Gloucester, and Boston fishermen's unions. And so he knew his way around politically, and he also he was the chairman of the county commission at the time. So when we get this job and we're going down to get the ship, what Harrington said is, we got to put a couple of shirts in a bag. We're going to go down there and leave everybody in Washington with the distinct impression, we're not leaving until we get what we came for. And lo and behold, that's fundamentally pretty much exactly what happened. The afternoon we signed for the ship, Ed Palmer was there and myself and Pat, I guess. I had the opportunity to sit in the Speaker of the House's chair, who at the time was John McCormick in the Capitol, between a newly minted senator by the name of Kennedy and the Speaker of the House. And as a 30-year-old Naval Reserve lieutenant, I couldn't help thinking, if these guys knew what was really going on here, you know, they'd never give me this ship. On the way home, Harrington always liked to have a drink. So Pat would say to me, you know, let's celebrate. So we're sitting in the back of this Eastern Airlines DC-9 plane flying back to Boston. He says, I am going to tell you something right now that you are not going to want to hear. And I said, okay. And I was feeling pretty good. I hadn't even touched the drink. But I was feeling pretty good, and he said, you are at the absolute zenith of your battleship career, and my advice is get out now. I actually took his advice, but it was 10 years later. So he was a critical component, and let me tell you how critical it was. Not only did he convey that message, but after the Navy kind of did a put down on us, because we didn't have enough money or we didn't have all of the various requirements they were talking about, Pat went to a guy by the name of, a fellow by the name of Paul Hall, who some of you will remember, who was the president of the Seafarers International Union for the whole country. He had the capacity to shut down the shipping on either the East Coast or West Coast. They never let him do it on both coasts, but once in a while he did it on one or the other. He produces Hall, and he brings him into the Capitol, and it was in a congressional hearing room, and Hall stands up and says to the assembled Navy people who are starting to backpedal that the Seafarers International Union is in convention in Washington right now, and they've just passed this resolution that this organization, the USS Mass Memorial Committee, should absolutely be given custody of the USS Massachusetts. I don't know whether there ever was such a resolution, but he stood up and said that. And lo and behold, about a week later, the ship actually was signed for, and about 5 days after that, she left Portsmouth, Virginia, where she was in the yard down there. We're going to see some slides starting right now. But when she left there, she headed for Fall River, and some of you will recall she arrived on an absolutely pristine, beautiful June Saturday afternoon. And I have to tell you, as she came under the Braga Bridge, I was standing with Governor Volpe, as she came under the Braga Bridge, I kind of paled because I had signed for it sight unseen, and I had no idea what kind of condition it was really in. My father subsequently said to me, do you go around doing this kind of thing all the time where you sign for things you've never seen? But it was fortuitous for me, and hopefully you'll think it's also been fortuitous for all of us. What I'd like to do at this point, I think there's a pointer here somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Can we have the first slide, please, Rob? Now, for all of you who think that this is the Battleship Massachusetts, don't be disappointed. It is. The second battleship that the Navy ever had was called USS Massachusetts, and this was BB-2. So you can see that the Battleship Massachusetts that you see today, BB-59, is obviously 57 ships later. The next shot is of the, Rob just squared me away on this. You'll notice that right here it says keel for cruiser USS Flint, Bethlehem. This is at Fall River in Quincy. The keel for the Flint is right here. But what you see here is the hull of the USS Massachusetts, which was launched in May of 1942. Most people have driven into Boston. Most people have probably never seen the shipyard in Fall River. Can I, just as a lock, how many people have actually seen the Fall River shipyard in Quincy where this ship was built? Okay, a couple. When you're going up to Boston and you take the left off of 128 right there in Braintree where the shopping center is, as you go up on the crest of the hill, if you look over to the far right, what you'll see is a great big ironworks, and that really is exactly where the battleship was built. And she was commissioned, she was commissioned in May of 1942. Rob? At the christening, Charles Francis Adams' wife was really the sponsor of the ship, and the Adams, as you recall, are the people who have really put Raytheon Company together. And she did her job. And her son, Charles Francis Adams, 25 years later, after his mother christened the ship, came down and did a reenactment in 1967 of the christening of the ship. In the early years, we didn't have the kind of professional staff that existed then, and certainly the ship didn't look like this either. But to give you an idea of how some of the volunteers work, I remember one afternoon being down on the ship and given a tour, okay, best as I could. I never served on a battleship. I was a destroyer sailor from 1956 to 1959, and my first exposure to being on board a battleship was right here. But these 16-inch guns, the Massachusetts fired the first 16-inch shell of World War II, and they also fired the last 16-inch shell of the Second World War. But the story I wanted to tell you, you got to have some fun with these things once in a while. Anybody remember a Ford Fairlane? Okay, a Ford Fairlane weighed 2,300 pounds. The shells that came out of these guns were 2,300 pounds. So I'm down there with this group one afternoon, and I say to them, you know, this is like firing a Ford Fairlane from right here in Fall River to Taunton. The guy in the back of the crowd said, can you use a Dodge Dart? We'll give you a better ride. Next slide, please. Here's what happens when those things really are fired. This happens to be the battleship Jean Bart in Casablanca Harbor in November of 1942. And there's good news for a lot of people's lives in this particular shot. They actually sunk the Jean Bart, and none of the shells exploded. What happened was they hit it, they blew the bottom out of it, but there was no explosion because the fuses on the ship, on these 16-inch shells, were defective. Had nothing to do with the ship or the crew. It was how they actually happened to be made. Has anybody, there's a book out, came out a year ago, An Army at Dawn, written by an individual by the name of Rick Atkinson. Anybody read the book? If you're interested in this kind of thing, it's a Pulitzer Prize winner. And the only reason I know what happened in this particular situation is I happened to go through that chapter last night where they talked about, it's all about the, it's a trilogy. The first book is written and the next two books on World War II will come along. But he also wrote A Long Gray Line. He's a superb writer. If you enjoy this kind of history, that's the kind of thing, that book is one of those things you'd really want to read. Next slide, please, Bob. This is 1962, okay? May of 62 in the Boston Sunday Herald, ships to be scrapped. And the Navy advised Congressman Philbin, who was also present when the signing took place, that the ship was going to be cut up. It was May of 1960, excuse me, it was August of 1964 when Fall River and the Battleship got together, and it was actually June of 1965 when the ship physically arrived here. Next, please. Where she came from, she was in the reserve fleet in Norfolk, people call it the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. It was actually the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard where the reserve fleet was, and one of those 12 or 15 people who really made this whole thing happen, who is still alive, is a fellow by the name of Strafford Morse. And Strafford actually was responsible for the battleship. He had graduated from Harvard out of the NROTC, and this ship was his responsibility. He's standing to show you how these kind of things unfold, he's standing at 53 State Street looking in the window of the bank, and there was a model of the ship, and Adler and a fellow by the name of Jack Cassidy, who also worked for the Boston Redevelopment Authority, happened to be standing there. And he just happened to say to these two guys, I know something about this ship. And they said, well, what do you know? And he gave them what his background was. And they said, come with us. And from that point on, he's been very involved. And when the ship was dry docked within the last 3 years, it was Adler who was the project officer for making it happen. He also did the Battleship Texas down in San Jacinto, down in the Houston area. And there's a couple more of these ships out there, so I'm sure Alec can work for the rest of his life doing this kind of thing. Excuse me, Morse could do that. Next slide. This is the ship as she's leaving Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. She's in the Norfolk Channel now, bound for Fall River. And this is Ed Palmer, to who we all owe so much, those of us who have a feeling for the ship. Unfortunately, Ed passed away this year, but he really made it happen. I put this in just so that people will say, who is that guy? Next. And this was the scene at the time when the ship first arrived, it was tied up where the Kennedy is right now. It was built on a destroyer tender pier, and one of the things the Navy really had a real hang-up about was leaving it in that particular berth because it wasn't heavy enough for anything like a hurricane. And this is Governor John Volpe. You know, it's getting kind of scary when you get to an age when you walk through some place and you see somebody's name who you knew. But Sheila and I were coming back from a trip last Thursday, and we were walking through the Volpe International Terminal at Logan. And he was really a classy guy, very solid individual, very supportive of what was going on with the ship. This gentleman here, I believe, is Mayor Damaris, and this was Leverett Saltonstall, who at the time was the governor of Massachusetts when the battleship was built. Volpe was smooth. I remember going up to meet him at the airport, and we're driving down, and he said to me, now who's this guy Feitelberg? And I said, well, sir, that's me. And he says, oh, you're Joe. I never gave him my name, so, you know, he's quick on his feet. Next. There's my good friend Paul Veitzes. This is Martin Adler, who was such a creative individual. Jack Brayton, who so many of you knew, and Tom Almey. The guy between them, even I don't recognize. But let me tell you just a little bit more about Adler. Adler, next slide, please. This is Adler. Adler's one of these guys who knew that on the back of the Massachusetts state flag there was a pine tree. And the reason for the pine tree is that Massachusetts used to also have Maine as part of Massachusetts. And that was why the pine tree was actually put on it. Adler picks up the fact, he makes this connection, and out of all of that came the Colonial Navy of Massachusetts, because the pine tree happened to be the Colonial Navy's flag, and that organization was spawned by, really the Colonial Navy was absolutely spawned by Adler through his activity with the ship, as was the Marine Museum through Jack Brayton's leadership, and also Margot and Tom Cottrell, along with a number of other people, have been very instrumental in the creation of that organization. When the ship first arrived, I think this is a particularly interesting picture, okay? This was really, I mean, this was a war zone down there in 1965. The bridge was literally not even finished. The bridge did not open. Route 195 did not open until the following spring. It was May of 1966. And you can see that this is shortly after the ship did arrive. She doesn't even have her mast stepped at this point, and it was a grim sight. How have things changed? This is the memorial on the ship, and it's very suitable that it ties together not only the greatest generation, as Brokaw called them, but also, you know, the generation coming along. And I can never, it seems, do anything where Adler doesn't pop up. Anybody ever ridden a subway in Boston? Huh? Okay. In the subways in Boston, there's all sorts of pictorial viewings down in the subways, and Marty borrows that idea, and because you can't scratch it, it's enamel, and the pictures that are down in the memorial area, and this happens to be one of them, you know, are right off that base. And this was Battleship Cove, obviously before the Hindusea. The reason for this particular picture is these were the mooring cells that the Navy required when we were in Washington right at the get-go. They said that ultimately the ship would have to be tied up here when there was no such thing in existence rather than here. And I'll tell you a quick story relative to it all. One of the great individuals politically, publicly, one of the great public personalities beside John Volpe was a fellow by the name of Frank Sargent. And Frank Sargent ultimately became the governor of Massachusetts. And at the time, in 1964, when the idea of the battleship came along, Sargent was the commissioner of the Division of Waterways for the Department of Public Works. He was a real preservationist. And when we went to Washington to get the ship, I said to Bill Torpy, who I was traveling with, I said, you know, we don't have anything to tie the ship and the state together. The ship had been designated by the state legislature as the official World War II memorial, but we don't have anything that ties the two organizations together. I said, we got to have something when we get down there to talk to the Navy. So I had written a letter to Frank Sargent, and I figured this is kind of last minute. You know, we're leaving that day. But the day before, I write a letter to Sargent, and then I was a little bold. But anyhow, we go up to see Sargent. He walks into his office around 8 o'clock in the morning, and Torpy and I are there, and he says to, Torpy gets up, and he knew him. I never even met the man. He said to him, Commissioner, he's now moved from Waterways, where he's responsible. He is the commissioner of the Department of Public Works. And Bill said to him, Commissioner, he says, we're here to talk to you about the Battleship Massachusetts, and we're not going to take much of your time. And Sargent says, Torpy, you are not going to take any of my time this morning because we don't have any time. You know, I figured, you know, all is lost. So I get up and I say to him, excuse me, Commissioner. I said, you don't even know who I am. But I said, I've written a letter relative to exactly what we need relative to permanent mooring for the ship. And the bold part of it was, I wrote his response. So I give him both of those things, and he takes a quick look at it, and he turns to me and he says, come back here in an hour. So an hour later, we go back, and he hands us this letter where he commits to build these mooring cells for $250,000 at the time, which, I mean, obviously in today's dollars, it's probably somewhere around $1.5 million. But He didn't have a dime in his budget, okay? He's making a commitment for the Commonwealth of $250,000. He doesn't have 10 cents set aside to do it. The good news was, by the time it came time to actually build them, he happened to be the governor. And so he put it in the budget, and away we went. Rob? Jim Gavin was the first real executive director that we had on the ship. A wonderful human being. Although he only served for 3 years, he served 3 years in the job that Captain Cummings has right now. But one of the things he did was he was very involved with a person who happens to be a particularly close friend of mine, and I know is of Maxine's, who's now also deceased, a fellow by the name of Ed Ward. And he and Ward together created what today is a 25,000 member organization national organization called Tin Can Sailors, which is a group of destroyermen. And obviously our friend Paul. Paul, anything you want? I never said a thing to Paul with any kind of a comment or otherwise where Paul didn't say to me, "That's great." You know, it's infectious being around people who have that kind of feeling. He was a remarkable human being, a dear friend, and I will always cherish our friendship. Paul was succeeded by Captain Guy Archambault, and Guy kept the standards high, and he did a nice job for probably the better part of, I think it was 8 or 9 years. And one of the absolute best things he did was he happened to hire, next slide, Ernie Cummings. I will tell you that as good as all of these people have been who I'm citing here, I have never felt more comfortable with what the future of Battleship Cove is than under the present management, and particularly the contribution that Captain Ernie Cummings has made. As you can see, to those of you who are familiar with these kind of things, his uniform is not as deep. This is not navy blue. This is Coast Guard blue. And the young, talented group that Captain... One other thing relative to him, because it is one of the reasons why he is such an exceptional individual for this job. Not only is he a very capable seaman, he had command of the Eagle for 5 years, the Coast Guard tall ship, the training ship, which is an eternity in the ship driving business. But in addition to that, he's also a teacher by trade, teaching all of these young Coast Guard, potential Coast Guard officers, and also a diplomat. During the Reagan administration, he circumnavigated the world, and he had the Eagle at the time that actually occurred. Next, Rob. The next addition to the Cove was the Lionfish. She happened to be a reserve ship that was over in Providence. She did have a distinguished career at the end of World War II, and it's a wonderful exhibit to anybody who really has the almost courage to go down and walk through an old submarine. I was an anti-submarine warfare officer for a couple of years before I became a gunnery officer, so I've always had a warm spot for these ships. Next. And the Kennedy, the Kennedy was really a great experience also. The Kennedy, it wasn't so much that it was the senator and the president's brother, but the Kennedy happened to be the same class of ship, which was a Gearing long-hull destroyer, 396 feet that I rode on. It was exactly the same kind of a ship. So I had a warm spot for anything that was close to what my personal experience was. Part of what Paul Veitzes and Ed Ward did together was they had been cultivating an organization called PT Boats Inc. And there's a Waring connection here. A number of you know that Liz and Jim and Sheila and myself happen to be very close personal friends, but Jim's uncle, Ellis Waring, befriended a man by the name of James Boats Newbury. And Newbury had a PT boat, which was down in Memphis on Mud Island, And Paul Weitzies and I went down there, and they had been working with these folks about us taking over their PT exhibit. And probably one of the finest exhibits in the Cove is that. And one of my really great experiences was having the opportunity to, when they were doing the search, they had 3 people who were doing the search. Boats Newbury, who really put this whole organization together, and the Tin Can Sailor organization was a direct takeoff of PT Boats Inc. But when they were doing the search, it was Boats Newbury and a gentleman by the name of Admiral John Bulkley. And John Bulkley became really very famous because he got the Congressional Medal of Honor for taking Douglas MacArthur off Corregidor and taking him to Australia. He was a crusty guy, and we went round and round, and of course, you know, I'm still kind of a kid, so to speak, and we're talking about what the potential was and what we really wanted to do and all that sort of thing. And lo and behold, at the very end of the conversation, thanks to Weitzies and Ward, who really kind of wound me up like a toy doll, and to say the right things at the right time, at the very end of the conversation, Bulkley said 2 nice things. And one of the things he told me to define himself was when we were talking about the Kennedy, which was already here, he said, I struck that ship from its rolls because it had a slight crack in the hull. So he was on extended permanent duty, just like Hyman Rickover was, the father of nuclear submarines. And it was really a wonderful experience. The other experience we had was Paul and I go down, and Newbury doesn't really want to take us out to see the PT boat. It happened to be the same PT boat that was in John Kennedy's inaugural parade. And I said, hey, Boats, I said, we didn't come all the way to Memphis. I said, I've signed for ships I've never seen. I said, wooden ships are another thing. We've really got to go see it. So we go out and we see it. And that evening, to make sure that he really had us hooked, he takes us over to a gentleman's name by man's name by the name of Henry Lowe. Henry happened to be the ex-mayor of Memphis and happened to be the mayor of Memphis when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And Henry should have been a senator from Tennessee, except that from a family point of view, his wife decided she couldn't really do that. Next. And now we're talking about the present. The thing that really makes Battleship Cove go today and where the future really lies is in the educational programs that are down there. Through the Raytheon Foundation, obviously tied back to the original sponsorship with the Adamses of the ship, there's some absolutely wonderful work being done in math and in sciences and through the summer months. And the thing that makes the ship live is what's going on here. And the overnight program financially is the program that really drives the ship. The ship can handle its operating costs, okay? It can handle the day-to-day operations, principally because of the visitorism, the tourism that it gets from folks like yourself and around the state and around this part of the country. She can't really deal with the capital needs. The capital needs being, it was necessary after 30-odd years, 35 years to dry dock the ship, and that required state assistance, and it was $10 million to dry dock the ship up there in South Boston. I believe it was 3.5 years ago. And so those kind of things are important. The other thing she really needs is she needs an endowment. Just like this church needed an endowment, there isn't anything of real substance that shouldn't be continued, and endowments are really the way to do that. And so principally due to work that Ernie and Dave Girton have done, they've done some wonderful work in this area, and we're going to talk just as we wind down here relative to that. This happened to be an event. Victory at Sea is a program that the ship has had now for the last 3 years, and Dave Girton, who's been mentioned earlier, went up to a very stylish lady who obviously was there with some grandchildren, about 3 years ago, and the lady who he approached just to find out how everything was going happened to be Emily DiMaggio, who was Dominic DiMaggio's wife. And the DiMaggios, both Dominic and Emily, have been absolutely terrific with the Battleship. And Victory at Sea is a program that is really making all sorts of things come alive down there. And one of the things that happened, to show you how these things build on themselves, you can't do it all with private funds, you can't do it all with public funds, but one of the things that is going on is that the Yorkie Foundation has also provided some money for this ongoing endowment sort of thing. This isn't, I'm not talking about socializing now, I'm talking about those programs that you saw with the children. And to kind of wrap it up, this shot probably better than anyone. If it hadn't been Ernie and his sailing experience, I don't care who the executive director was, the boating program that has really blossomed down in Battleship Cove and is good for probably 4 months a year right now. And the number of youngsters who are down participating in this program, including schools like Providence Country Day that runs their sailing program out of here now. There's all sorts of contact that's being made, you know, with the community as a result of this particular program. And it ties lots of things together. It's a very sheltered area, and it's ideal for doing exactly this. Oh, back one. Can we reverse it? There we go. Okay, with that, what I'd like to do, we've got to have a time check. Everything requires a time check, right? Okay, great. We're right where we wanted to be. Be happy to entertain any questions for a couple of minutes here, and would like to put in a real plug that you really stand by and listen to Charlie Sargady talk about the Fall River. I didn't know there was a Fall River crew members organization, but I learned it within the last 48 hours. And the story of the